Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we follow Miss Marple into a quiet room where a locked drawer hides a single whispering thread and a secret no one meant to leave behind. Before we begin, where in the world are you listening from? Now pour something warm and let the mystery begin. Morning in St. Mary Mead arrived with the kind of delicate, well-behaved sunlight that made even the vicarage roses look dutiful. The village existed in its usual state of quiet equilibrium. Milk bottles clinking at doorsteps, a far-off kettle whistling, and the faint murmur of Mrs. Clement's wireless drifting from an open window. Nothing in the scene suggested trouble. Everything was as it ought to be. But within those first soft minutes of the day, a slight disturbance trembled at the edges of the calm like a clock hesitating between ticks. It came not from sound, but from movement. The curtain in the old post office fluttered when there was no breeze at all. Miss Marple, strolling back from her early walk, noticed the shift. Strange, she thought, how a curtain could suggest someone standing just beyond view. Yet when she paused, the movement stilled, leaving only the familiar stillness of the high street. The village prepared for its small excitement of the day the charity mending circle hosted at Mrs. Penrose's cottage. Threads, needles, gossip. St. Mary Mead excelled at stitching lives together and pulling them apart. Miss Marple planned to attend, as she always did, her gentle presence as much a fixture as the teapot set out on the sideboard. Mrs. Penrose greeted her guests with the brittle warmth of someone who wished her house were just a little grander. Laughter fluttered through the sitting room as women took their places, baskets of mending at their feet. A cream-colored drawer unit stood by the window, an heirloom, Mrs. Penrose liked to say, though its scratches suggested years of quarrels with clumsy hands. Miss Hartnell provided the morning's first twist of tone. "I've been thinking," she announced, threading her needle with unnecessary vigor, "that the village has become awfully careless lately. Keys left indoors, pantry windows unlatched, drawers not properly closed." "Drawers?" Mrs. Price Ridley asked sharply, as if she were personally implicated. "Yes," Miss Hartnell replied. "Mrs. Penrose, you left this one open just now." She pointed at the small heirloom drawer unit. Mrs. Penrose stiffened. "Impossible. That drawer locks." Several heads turned. Indeed, the top drawer slightly shed a slim sliver of shadow inside. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window, observed the room's reaction. A locked drawer opens when it should not be curious. More curious still was the faint thread caught between the drawer's edge and the frame pale blue, almost invisible unless one happened to look closely. Mrs. Penrose approached with flustered authority. "Well, really," she muttered, tugging gently. The drawer refused to open further. She fetched the small brass key from her apron pocket, slid it into the lock, and tried again. This time it opened with a reluctant sigh. Inside lay its usual collection of sentimental clutter letters, tied with faded ribbon, a brooch missing a stone, a handkerchief embroidered with initials long forgotten. The women leaned in with the collective eagerness of natural snoops. Miss Marple kept her distance, noticing instead the pale blue thread still clinging to the drawer's interior corner. A thread with no visible origin among the stored items. The room's chatter continued, though unease threaded through it. Mrs. Penrose snapped the drawer shut with defensive finality. There. Nothing amiss. But equilibrium, once disturbed, does not entirely return. The mending circle resumed, though the conversation grew more pointed. Mrs. Price Ridley speculated about wandering hands. "You can never be too careful," she declared, stitching a hem with the self-righteousness of one sewing up virtue itself. "Perhaps a draught moved it," Mrs. Clement suggested. "There is no draught," Mrs. Hartnell insisted. Miss Marple said nothing. She repaired a small tear in a child's jumper with delicate competence, her mind quietly aligning the details. A locked drawer, unlocked. A thread left behind. and the way Mrs. Penrose had paled, not the startled pallor of embarrassment, but something softer, deeper, as though an old fear had brushed her shoulder. Later, during tea, Mr. Penrose returned home earlier than expected. He was a thin man with the air of someone who believed he deserved a larger audience. Upon seeing the assembled women, he forced a genial smile. "Ladies, I trust you're not mending my reputation today?" Mrs. Penrose laughed, but her fingers tightened around her teacup. Miss Marple watched the couple. There was something brittle between them, like porcelain hairline cracks, only visible when the light caught just so. As cups emptied and the gathering dispersed, a subtle tension followed the women out into the afternoon sun. Miss Marple lingered a moment, drawn once more to the drawer unit. She examined the lock. Ordinary, a bit worn. One could, with sufficient familiarity, open it without the key. But why would Mrs. Penrose pretend it could not? "Something on your mind, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Penrose asked, her voice strained. "Oh, nothing at all," Miss Marple replied lightly. "Only admiring your charming furniture." Mrs. Penrose's smile flickered. "Yes, it's been in my family for years." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, noting again the pale blue thread caught beneath the wood. She brushed it gently with a fingertip and let it fall. The smallest things she'd always found revealed the largest truths. As she stepped outside, the curtain in the post office once more fluttered without wind. Or perhaps, she thought, with a wind that moved only where eyes lingered. Something in St. Mary Mead was shifting, like sunlight dimming behind clouds no one had noticed. It was only towards evening, as Miss Marple returned home, that she heard the first rumor whispered through the hedgerow that something had happened at the Penrose cottage. Something troubling enough that the doctor had been called. Something that began, so people said, with a locked drawer that hadn't been locked at all. And somewhere inside that drawer, someone had left a thread behind. The rumor drifted with Miss Marple along the narrow lane, growing sharper with each step as voices carried from open gates and clipped hedges. Mrs. Weatherby stood halfway down the path to her cottage, arms stiff at her sides, as though caught between the need to whisper and the need to appear absolutely above such things. She offered Miss Marple a look that trembled with significance. "They've called for Dr. Leonard," she murmured, lowering her voice further. "To the Penroses. And at such an hour, too. One doesn't call the doctor unless something is quite wrong." Miss Marple made a sympathetic sound, neither encouraging nor discouraging the flow of speculation. The village, however, required little prompting. Within minutes, she encountered Mr. Taverner, who had abandoned sweeping his doorstep in favor of leaning conspicuously over his gate. "Fainted dead away, I heard," he said. "Mrs. Penrose. Can't imagine over what unless it's that drawer everyone's talking about." Then, with relish, locked drawers aren't always what they seem, you know. Miss Marple continued down the lane, the faint evening light softening the outlines of the houses. Yet beneath the calm, she sensed an undercurrent running through St. Mary Mead, like a ripple beneath an unbroken surface. Fear, mild but growing, had begun to stir the air. This village, so fond of its tidy appearances, reacted sharply to the suggestion that something untidy lurked behind a respectable door. At the gate of the Penrose cottage, the doctor's motor car stood angled awkwardly, its headlamps still faintly ticking as they cooled. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before following the stone path to the door. It stood slightly ajar. A murmured conversation floated out, strained and uneven. Inside, Mrs. Penrose lay on the sitting-room sofa, a damp cloth pressed to her forehead. The drawer unit's top drawer, now fully closed, seemed to watch from the corner like a silent participant in the drama. Dr. Leonard looked up as Miss Marple entered. He did not appear surprised to see her, merely resigned to the ways of village knowledge. "She's had a shock," he said quietly. "Nothing dangerous, but it appears something has upset her more than she's willing to say. Mr. Penrose hovered nearby, pale and restless. "All this fuss over nothing," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "My wife gets worked up easily." Really, these women and their chatter, Mrs. Penrose stirred. "It wasn't the chatter," she murmured, her eyes fluttering. "It was what I found." A small tightening occurred around Mr. Penrose's mouth. "My dear, you're not well. You should rest." Miss Marple lowered herself onto a nearby chair, hands folded neatly. "Some things," she said pleasantly, "become clearer when spoken aloud. They can lose their frightfulness in the telling." Mrs. Penrose gripped the cloth more tightly. "Not this. I opened the drawer again after everyone left. I wanted to make sure nothing was missing." Her breath trembled, but something was there. Something that wasn't mine. The doctor shot Mr. Penrose a cautionary glance. "Perhaps we should—" "No," Mrs. Penrose insisted, sitting up. Her eyes shone with the rawness of someone who had glimpsed something she wished she had not. There was a photograph. Folded. Old. I didn't recognize it, and when I tried to show it to Henry, her voice broke. It was gone. Someone took it. The room grew still, the kind of stillness that gathers when multiple truths attempt to surface at once. Mr. Penrose looked at his wife with forced calm. "You were overwhelmed," he said. "There was no photograph. You imagined it." Miss Marple watched him closely. His certainty felt hurried, ill-fitted, like a coat worn in the wrong season. She also noticed the faint indentation on the carpet near the drawer. Someone had knelt there recently. Perhaps in haste. "I don't think I imagined it," Mrs. Penrose whispered. The face blurred somehow, but familiar, and the blue thread I didn't put there. Dr. Leonard began to pack his bag, his movements careful. "Rest," he said firmly. "All of this can wait until morning." But Miss Marple sensed the urgency beneath the surface, the way Mrs. Penrose trembled as though holding back more than a fainting spell, and the way Mr. Penrose's eyes slid repeatedly toward the drawer, as if afraid it might open of its own accord. When the doctor ushered her out, Miss Marple paused on the threshold. The evening had settled into a soft hush, but the quiet held a curious weight as though the village itself were holding its breath. A thread had been pulled, and something hidden was beginning to unravel. As she walked away, Miss Marple could almost hear the whisper of that pale blue thread caught in the drawer's edge, tugging just lightly enough to disturb the peace once more. The hush accompanying Miss Marple along the lane felt almost companionable, as though the village itself walked beside her, waiting to see what she would notice next. Lamps were being lit one by one behind lace curtains, casting soft amber onto gardens where the first nightbirds stirred. The quiet tug of that pale blue thread lingered in her thoughts, not only as a physical clue, but as something symbolic, a thin line pulling at hidden corners of the Penroses' domestic life. Before she reached her gate, a brisk voice cut through the stillness. "Miss Marple, just a word if you don't mind." Inspector Crail approached with the clipped steps of a man determined to appear in control. His presence in St. Mary Mead often created a mild disturbance. He admired Miss Marple, respected her even, yet could not quite conceal his irritation when the village seemed to trust her judgment more than his reports. Tonight, however, he looked unusually sober. "I've just come from the Penroses," he said. "Dr. Leonard sent word. Fainting spells are one thing, but talk of missing items, well, we can't dismiss it." Miss Marple angled her head with polite curiosity. It must be difficult to determine what is missing when the owner is too distressed to say. "That's the trouble," Crail sighed. "Mrs. Penrose insists there was a photograph in that drawer." "Old," she said. "Folded. Yet her husband swears there was no such thing." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured gently. Husbands do sometimes insist rather quickly, when silence might serve better. He gave her a dry look. You think he's hiding something? I think, she replied, that people react to fear in oddly revealing ways. Crail gestured for them to walk. If there was a photograph, someone must have taken it. The Penroses didn't leave the house. No sign of forced entry, and the drawer was supposedly locked. He paused. You were at the mending circle. Did anything strike you as unusual? Miss Marple considered, only that the drawer was found partially open when it should not have been, and that Mrs. Penrose looked far more troubled than one might expect from an idle accident. Fear, Inspector, tends to leave fingerprints of a psychological sort. They reached the small green near the vicarage, where the evening gathered like a soft shawl around the trees. Crail lowered his voice. There's another matter. Mr. Penrose gave me permission to inspect the drawer. Nothing inside but trinkets, but the lining of the velvet had a faint imprint, rectangular, about the size of a folded photograph. Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. Then Mrs. Penrose was not imagining it. No, he admitted, but the photograph wherever it vanished before anyone else could see it. A single magpie hopped along the green, tilting its head as though listening. Its solitary presence echoed Miss Marple's own sense of imbalance, one piece missing from an otherwise familiar picture. Crail tucked his notebook away. There's more. Mrs. Penrose seemed genuinely frightened, not merely flustered, and her husband grew rather defensive when I asked about family photographs. Miss Marple's knitting bag swung lightly at her side as she walked. People often hide the very things that might explain them, she said softly. It is a peculiar instinct, particularly among the respectable. Crail halted. And the thread? The doctor mentioned she'd spoken of one. Yes, Miss Marple answered. A pale blue thread caught in the corner of the drawer, not belonging to any item inside. Crail frowned. Blue thread. Does Mrs. Penrose do any embroidery in that colour? She does not, Miss Marple replied. Nor did any of the ladies today use such a shade. He exhaled slowly. So someone with blue thread on their clothing has some fibre that might catch if they rummaged through a drawer in haste. Something just so. Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her mind traced the possibilities of someone who moved quietly, knew the layout of the house, and had reason to search for something hidden away. Someone who might have been watching earlier the fluttering curtain at the post office, the faint shadow when no breeze stirred. Crail looked toward the Penroses' lane. I'll start by speaking to the neighbors. Someone might have seen a passerby. That may help, Miss Marple said gently, though the eyes that see most clearly often belong to those who are not looking directly. He gave her a puzzled glance, but she offered only a pleasant nod. Will you keep me informed? If only to prevent you forming your own investigation, he muttered. Yes, I'll keep you informed. As he departed, Miss Marple lingered under the lamplight. The glow illuminated the faintest sheen on her spectacles, giving her expression a thoughtful, almost melancholy cast. She traced the scene in her mind. The shifting curtain, the open drawer, the missing photograph, the blue thread. Appearances, she reflected, were rarely accurate reflections. More often, they were veils drawn carefully over truth. She had just turned toward her cottage when a figure rounded the bend-hurried footsteps, breath uneven, eyes wide with something perilously close to dread. Miss Marple, the figure whispered, glancing back as though afraid of being followed. I need to speak with you. It's about the Penroses and what was in that drawer. The lamplight caught the sheen of the stranger's anxious eyes as Miss Marple steered them gently toward the shadowed edge of the green. Only then did she recognize him properly, Tom Derry, the young clerk from the post office, a quiet, quick-moving lad who lived with his aunt and seldom drew attention. His breath came in shallow bursts, and he cast nervous glances at the nearby cottages as though afraid one of their curtains might shift. I shouldn't be out here, Tom murmured. But after what happened, I couldn't keep it to myself. Miss Marple's tone remained warm, steady. Then you were quite right to come, dear. You'll feel better once you've said your piece. He swallowed hard. I saw someone earlier today, near the Penrose place, not long before the doctor was called. The air shifted around them, mild evening warmth tinged with suspense. Miss Marple let the silence encourage him. "It was Mr. Penrose," Tom whispered. He came out of the house looking pale as anything, kept checking behind him as though afraid someone might follow. But what struck me most, he shoved something into his coat pocket like he didn't want anyone to see. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Did you recognize what it was?" "No, but it wasn't the size of a letter or parcel. More like a folded bit of card or a photograph." A soft wind stirred, moving through the leaves above them with the faintest rustle like the whisper of a thread being pulled through fabric. Miss Marple folded her hands, her thoughts arranging themselves with quiet precision. Mr. Penrose's haste, his insistence on Mrs. Penrose's confusion, his too quick denial of the photograph's existence, all of it aligned uncomfortably with Tom's account. But village life rarely allowed a single motive to stand alone. "Why come to me?" Miss Marple asked gently. Tom hesitated, and for a moment she saw an older sorrow flicker across his young face. "Because if Mr. Penrose is hiding something, he won't want the police poking around. And I think Mrs. Penrose's fainting wasn't because of something she found. It was because of something she realized." Miss Marple absorbed that, filing it away with the delicacy of slipping a needle through cloth. Realization often struck harder than discovery. Tom looked toward the post office, its dark windows reflecting the lamplight. "There's more," he said quietly. "A woman came to the counter this morning before the mending circle. She asked if there were any letters for someone called Hartley. No address given, no surname. She seemed nervous and kept glancing toward the Penroses' lane." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened subtly. "What did she look like?" "Middle ages. Well-dressed but faded somehow, like everything she wore once belonged to better days." Tom shifted uneasily. "When I asked if she wanted to leave a note, she said she'd come back later, but she never did." A second possible thread, faint but undeniable, tugged at the edge of the mystery. Someone searching for a name with no surname, someone watching the lane, the Penroses' door. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on Tom's arm. "You did the responsible thing by telling me, and you mustn't trouble yourself more than necessary." "But what if it leads to trouble for me?" he blurted. "Mr. Penrose sometimes posts important documents. He's not the sort to forgive being talked about." "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple said with a soft chuckle. "In my experience, people who fear suspicion are far more eager to appear forgiving than to show their true tempers." Tom managed a faint, unsteady smile, then slipped away into the shadows, leaving Miss Marple alone beneath the lamplight. She stood very still, allowing the threads and otherwise to cross and separate in her mind. Mr. Penrose's furtive behavior, the missing photograph, Mrs. Penrose's distress, and now the stranger asking after a name that might have belonged to another life. On the surface, Mr. Penrose made an excellent first suspect. Too excellent, Miss Marple thought. Villagers often believed guilt revealed itself in obvious ways, but true guilt usually concealed itself behind immaculate respectability. The more someone seemed conveniently implicated, the more she questioned the angle from which they were viewed. Her contemplation ended abruptly when footsteps approached from behind. Miss Hartnell emerged, her expression sharp with purpose. "I thought I saw you speaking with that Derry boy," she said. "You should be careful, Miss Marple. Some people are not what they seem." Miss Marple's eyes softened with polite interest. "Oh, and whom might you mean?" Miss Hartnell's lips pursed, as though holding a secret that delighted her. "The Penroses, for a start, and perhaps others." She lowered her voice. If something unpleasant has happened, it won't surprise me. Not one bit. Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. The remark lacked cruelty but carried the unmistakable satisfaction of someone who had long suspected a moral crack in a neighbor's facade. Appearances and truth, Miss Marple reflected, rarely walked hand in hand, and there was something in Miss Hartnell's tone, a quiet relish, that hinted she knew more than she had yet chosen to share. Miss Marple regarded Miss Hartnell with the kind of mild, almost grandmotherly interest that encouraged confidences without ever seeming to solicit them. The lamplight caught the sharp line of Miss Hartnell's jaw, revealing just how pleased she was to have stumbled upon what she believed to be a moral advantage. "And what leads you to such certainty, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently, adjusting her shawl as though preparing for nothing more dramatic than a mild breeze. Miss Hartnell cast another quick glance toward the Penroses' lane. "People pretend," she said, her voice bristling with conviction. "They pretend to be happy, to be respectable, to be content. But you can always tell when something is amiss. I've seen them quarreling more than once. And Mrs. Penrose, well, she has that look of a woman carrying a burden she daren't name." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Pain concealed under politeness is not uncommon in village life." "Quite." Miss Hartnell's eyes gleamed. "And the husband has more money than manners, too quick to laugh, too quick to deny things. If ever a man had secrets, it is Henry Penrose." The breeze stirred again, brushing against the leaves with a faint rustle like fabric shifting in a drawer. The sound seemed to deepen Miss Marple's reflection, though her expression remained serenely attentive. "But," Miss Hartnell went on, "there's something else. Something I didn't tell Inspector Crail." "Not yet." Miss Marple tilted her head, her hands still. "Oh, and why not?" "Because I wanted to think it over first," Miss Hartnell replied, a touch defensively. "One must be sure before speaking to the authorities." "A very sensible approach," Miss Marple said softly. Miss Hartnell took a step closer, lowering her voice. "This morning, before the mending circle, I passed by the Penroses' garden, and I distinctly heard voices raised in their sitting room, Mrs. Penrose pleading, and her husband telling her to stop imagining ghosts." "Ghosts, Miss Marple? What respectable man says such a thing?" Miss Marple's thoughts flickered briefly to the pale blue thread, the vanished photograph, and Tom Derry's account of a mysterious woman, the post office asking after someone named Hartley. Ghost sires, the past often returned in forms that polite conversation refused to acknowledge. And, Miss Hartnell added triumphantly, when Mrs. Penrose left for the mending circle afterwards, she looked frightfully anxious, almost ill. She paused. If she found something today that frightened her, perhaps it merely confirmed a fear she already carried. Miss Marple considered this, then thanked Miss Hartnell kindly for the information. "These small details, my dear, often help the larger picture take shape. But one must never assume the shape will be the one we expect." Miss Hartnell sniffed, unconvinced. When the woman finally departed, Miss Marple walked slowly along the green, letting her thoughts settle like dust in a sunbeam. The scene Miss Hartnell described, the quarrel, the reference to ghosts, suggested that the photograph Mrs. Penrose saw was not merely a curiosity, but a reminder of something the couple wished to forget, something that had intruded, uninvited, into their carefully arranged domestic order. As she reached her own garden gate, Miss Marple paused. A faint glimmer caught her eye near the hedge, a small scrap caught on a thorn. Not paper, not cloth, thread, pale blue. It swayed almost imperceptibly in the evening air as though in recognition. She approached, examining the fragment. It had the same fine texture as the thread she'd seen caught in Mrs. Penrose's drawer. A coincidence would be easy enough to accept. Blue was a common color, after all, but something about its placement felt intentional, as if someone who had brushed past in haste had snagged it unknowingly. But why here? Why her garden? A soft crunch of gravel behind her announced careful footsteps. Miss Marple turned to see Inspector Crail emerging from the path, his expression tight with urgency. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've just spoken with Mrs. Penrose again. She's calmer now, but there's something she remembered. Something she said she saw before she fainted." Miss Marple held the small scrap of blue thread delicately between her fingers, feeling the faint tremble of consequence in its weave. "And what was that, Inspector?" Crail hesitated. She said she thought someone was standing in the doorway behind her. Just for a moment, watching her open the drawer. Miss Marple looked down at the thread, then at Crail, a quiet knowing settling behind her eyes. "Someone," he added, "swears she recognized." Inspector Crail's words hung in the evening air like a thin mist, delicate yet unsettling. Miss Marple closed her fingers gently around the scrap of pale blue thread, her gaze steady on the inspector. The faint rustling of the garden hedge seemed to echo the tremor of implication now stretching between them. "She recognized the figure?" Miss Marple asked. "So she claims." Crail's tone was grave, though touched with frustration. "But when I pressed her, she wouldn't give a name. Said she may have been mistaken. Said the light was strange. Typical vacillation." "Or fear," Miss Marple murmured. Crail blinked. "Fear." She nodded softly. "People rarely hesitate out of confusion, Inspector. More often they hesitate because speaking might unravel more than they are prepared to face." The inspector exhaled, glancing toward the darkened lane. "I need to know who she saw. Whoever it was may have taken that photograph. Or," Miss Marple added gently, "they may be the reason she hid it there in the first place." The remark settled sharply between them, though Miss Marple made no effort to elaborate. Instead, she tucked the threads safely into her glove and suggested they speak with Mrs. Penrose together if, she added delicately, "you don't think it would unsettle her too greatly." Crail hesitated, then nodded. As they approached the Penrose cottage, the lamplight in the windows glowed unevenly, as though the house itself labored under the strain of concealed truths. Mrs. Penrose sat upright on the sofa now, wrapped in a shawl that did little to steady her trembling hands. Her eyes darted between the inspector and Miss Marple with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I shouldn't have said anything earlier," she began, her fingers knotting the fabric of the shawl. "It was a silly trick of the light, perhaps." Miss Marple settled beside her, her presence a quiet balm. "My dear, sometimes the mind recognizes what the heart would prefer not to see." Mrs. Penrose flinched at the words. Crail leaned forward. "You said you recognized the person standing in the doorway," he began gently. "You don't need to explain anything else. Just tell us who it was." The woman's breath caught. For a moment she looked as though she might speak, but then her gaze slid toward the stairs, toward the shadowed landing above. Something in the darkness seemed to hold her tongue. "I can't," she whispered. "Please don't ask me again." Crail stiffened, but Miss Marple touched his arm lightly, urging patience. "There were 3 women at the mending circle today," Miss Marple said softly, her tone conversational. 4, if one counts Mrs. Clement arriving late, and several villagers passed your gate this morning, I believe. Some faces are quite ordinary until the right memory attaches itself." Mrs. Penrose's expression faltered subtly, but enough for Miss Marple to mark which suggestion had struck deepest. Not the mending circle. Someone passed the gate earlier, someone whose presence she associated with something older, unresolved. Henry Penrose entered the room abruptly, his collar askew as though he dressed in haste. "Inspector," he said coolly, "my wife is unwell. This line of questioning is intolerable." Mrs. Penrose tensed, shoulders drawing in like those of a bird hounded by a hawk. Crail stood. "With respect, Mr. Penrose, we believe she saw someone inside your home today." "That's absurd," Penrose snapped. "No one enters my house without my knowledge." His vehemence seemed too sharp, too quick, like a door slammed before one could glimpse what lay behind it. Miss Marple's gaze fell to his cuffs, frayed ever so slightly, and threaded through one loose fibre a faint tint of blue. Not enough to accuse, not enough to prove, but enough to know. Penrose followed her gaze and tugged his sleeve down at once. "There's no point entertaining these fancies," he insisted. "My wife is overwrought." Mrs. Penrose closed her eyes, pain flickering across her features at the dismissal. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "objects tucked away in drawers belong not to the present, but to the past, and the past rarely stays where one puts it." Penrose's jaw tightened. "Good evening, Miss Marple." Crail escorted her out, but his frustration was palpable. "Did you see that?" he muttered once they reached the lane. "He's practically begging to be suspected." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her voice thoughtful. "But eagerness to deflect suspicion does not always equate to guilt. Sometimes it is merely eagerness to hide shame." They reached the gate when Crail paused. "You still think someone else may be involved?" Miss Marple looked down the road. A dim figure stood at its far end, watching, not moving, a silhouette against the uneven lamplight feminine, still, waiting. "Inspector," she said softly, "I do believe someone wishes very much to speak with us." The stillness of the road deepened as Miss Marple and Inspector Crail approached the waiting silhouette. A street lamp flickered overhead, revealing the woman's features in a soft, wavering glow. She was the same woman Tom Derry had described: the faded elegance, the anxious poise, the way her hands clutched her handbag as though it contained her remaining courage. When she spoke, her voice carried the brittleness of a life frayed at the edges. "I didn't want to be seen near the Penroses' home earlier," she said. "But now I can't stay silent." Her eyes settled on Miss Marple with the resigned recognition of someone who had heard enough village tales to know whom to trust. "May I speak with you somewhere private?" Crail, wary but curious, gestured toward the small bench near the vicarage gate. The woman hesitated, then followed, her steps hesitant as though walking into confession rather than conversation. "My name is Mrs. Fenton," she began. "Well, it used to be that. I've gone by other names since." Her voice wavered, but she continued. "I came to St. Mary Mead this morning hoping to retrieve a letter, one that never arrived." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression the very picture of sympathetic attention. "And whom was the letter from?" Mrs. Fenton's gaze dropped. "From a man named Hartley." At that single name, a faint ripple passed through Crail's subtle shift of posture, a tightening of the shoulders. Miss Marple noticed. The name meant nothing to her directly, but the inspector's reaction suggested otherwise. Mrs. Fenton swallowed. "Hadn't heard from Mr. Hartley in years. But recently, someone told me he might be living under another name here, in this village." Her voice cracked. "With a wife." Miss Marple felt the implications settle into place with quiet weight. Threads blew and otherwise began to form a pattern of reinvention, secrets, and the inevitable collapse of carefully constructed appearances. "Why come today?" Crail asked gently. "Because," Mrs. Fenton whispered, "I received an anonymous note last week. Someone told me that if I wanted the truth about Mr. Hartley, I would find it in a cottage drawer in St. Mary Mead." The inspector stiffened. "Someone led you here deliberately." She nodded. "I arrived early. I walked past the cottage, wondering if I dared go in. And then I saw someone watching me from the window." Miss Marple exchanged a quiet glance with Crail. The fluttering curtain. Mrs. Fenton wiped a trembling hand across her cheek. "I panicked. I went to the post office to ask about letters, to see if any trace of his name existed, but afterward I lost my nerve. I didn't approach the cottage again. Crale's tone sharpened. "And what connection do you believe Mr. Hartley has to the Penroses?" "He was my husband," she answered softly, "until he vanished 20 years ago." Miss Marple felt the emotional echo behind the words, sorrow preserved like an old photograph folded unseen in a drawer. She let the silence expand just enough to honor it. "Mrs. Fenton," she said gently, "did you recognize anyone in the Penroses' home today, even from a distance?" The woman hesitated. "Not then. But as I walked away earlier, I passed a man on the lane. He froze when he saw me." Her fingers tightened around her handbag. I think it was him." Crale frowned. "Who?" "Mr. Hartley." Her voice trembled, but older, and calling himself Henry Penrose. A cold hush settled over the bench, a hush in which Miss Marple heard the faintest whisper of fate tugging the blue thread taut. Crale rose sharply. "If this is true, Mrs. Fenton, you should have said so earlier." She flinched. "I was afraid. If he recognized me, he might try to silence me." Miss Marple considered the claim. Fear made people certain in strange ways, and memory played tricks. Yet the timing, the secretive drawer, the vanished photograph, all aligned with this astonishing possibility. Before Crale could pursue further questions, a sudden commotion erupted from the Penrose lane. A shout, hurried footsteps, the sound of something wooden striking the ground. The three turned instantly. A man ran toward the home of the neighbors, breathless and wild-eyed. "Inspector, it's Mr. Penrose!" he cried. He collapsed in his garden, just falling without a sound. Crale bolted toward the lane. Miss Marple followed, her steps brisk despite her age. Mrs. Fenton remained rooted, trembling behind them like a figure in a fading photograph. When Miss Marple reached the gate, she saw Mr. Penrose on the grass, unmoving, his face drained of color. Dr. Leonard knelt beside him, checking for breath with grim urgency. Crale's voice cut through the night. "Is he alive?" The doctor looked up, eyes shadowed. "Barely. And there's something strange. This wasn't a simple collapse. Something is terribly wrong." Miss Marple felt the quiet dread rising beneath the village's fragile facade. Something had shifted. Something decisive. She looked toward the darkened cottage door, slightly ajar. The blue thread in her glove seemed suddenly heavier. Dr. Leonard's grim announcement hovered over the garden like a chill mist. Miss Marple stepped closer, her expression serene but intent, studying Mr. Penrose's still forms with an eye trained by years of observing the subtleties of human frailty, physical and moral. His breathing was shallow, faintly erratic, and his left hand lay curled near his chest as though clutching at something now gone. Inspector Crale's voice broke through the uneasy quiet. "Doctor, what do you mean by something strange?" Dr. Leonard pressed 2 fingers gently to Penrose's neck. "His pulse is irregular, but not in a way I'd attribute to natural illness. There's a faint discoloration here, see?" He tilted the man's collar to reveal a subtle blotch near the clavicle. "It suggests a stimulant or a toxin in the bloodstream. I can't be certain until tests are done." Crale stiffened. So this could be deliberate. "I'm not ruling anything out," the doctor replied. Miss Marple bent slightly, taking in the scene with delicate precision. The grass around Penrose was undisturbed. No struggle, no overturned soil, but just beside his fallen hand she saw the faintest glinted metal button, pale and small, half hidden by the lawn. She did not touch it. Instead, she simply noted its presence and filed it neatly away in her thoughts. Crale straightened. "We need to move him inside. Doctor, help me." As they lifted Mr. Penrose, Miss Marple watched the doorway still as though some answer lay in the quiet shadows beyond. Mrs. Penrose appeared there, clutching the frame, face ghostly pale. "What's happened?" she gasped. The doctor answered gently. "Your husband has collapsed. We need to bring him in and settle him on the sofa." Miss Marple saw the shock ripple through the woman, not the sharp panic of surprise, but the deeper, hollowed kind of fear that grows out of a long-held dread. Mrs. Penrose stepped aside mechanically, allowing them to pass. When the men carried Mr. Penrose to the sitting room, Miss Marple followed at a respectful distance, observing the faint tremors in Mrs. Penrose's hands as she hovered helplessly nearby. Once Penrose was laid on the sofa, Crail turned to his wife. "We must know where you were when this happened." Her voice emerged unsteady. "In the kitchen, making tea. I heard nothing, only the neighbors shout." Miss Marple spoke softly. "My dear, had you and your husband spoken since Inspector Crail and I left earlier?" Mrs. Penrose hesitated too long. "Just briefly," she whispered. He was unsettled. He said he needed to clear his head. "Did he mention the photograph again?" Miss Marple asked gently. A flicker crossed the woman's face. Guilt. Pain. Perhaps both. "No," she said quietly. He refused to discuss it any further. Crail studied her carefully. "Did he take anything with him into the garden?" She shook her head. "Not that I saw." Miss Marple noted the uncertainty in her tone. A woman who feared the truth sometimes convinced herself she had not witnessed it. While the doctor tended to Penrose, Crail asked Mrs. Penrose to accompany him outside for further questions. Miss Marple lingered in the sitting room not to pry, but to observe. She moved toward the drawer unit, its polished surface reflecting a softened version of the lamplight. "It is closed now, quite firmly closed." She glanced at the carpet. The indentation near the drawer, still faintly visible, was joined now by another slight impression, newer, less defined, as though someone had knelt again. A quiet click drew her attention. Mrs. Fenton had entered the room, summoned by fear more than invitation. "Is Mr. Penrose dying?" she whispered. Miss Marple met her eyes. "The doctor is hopeful, but matters are very serious." Mrs. Fenton clasped her hands tightly. "I didn't want this. I came for answers, not for harm." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "The past rarely returns gently, my dear. It tends to bring the very consequences we thought we had outrun." Mrs. Fenton's breath hitched. "Inspector Crail will think I did something." "And did you?" Miss Marple asked, not accusing, merely precise. "No." The denial was immediate, but desperation colored it. "I only wanted to confront him, to ask why he disappeared. Why did he leave me with nothing but debts and shame? I never touched him, I swear." Miss Marple believed her. But belief and proof were siblings, not twins. They shared a resemblance, not an identity. Before Miss Marple could speak again, the doctor stepped into the doorway. "He's regaining consciousness," Dr. Leonard said, "but his pulse is unstable. We must be prepared for the possibility that he was poisoned." The room chilled at the word. Poison quiet, intimate, deceptive, much like misplaced respectability. Miss Marple turned her attention to Penrose. His eyelids fluttered, his lips parted. A faint sound escaped him, no word, just a strained breath that hinted at intention. Mrs. Fenton moved forward. "Henry Hartley, can you hear me?" Mr. Penrose's eyes opened slowly, and then, with the effort of someone reaching for a memory too heavy to lift, he turned his head away from her. Miss Marple watched the motion with calm precision. Avoidance was not guilt, but it was very often knowledge. And especially knowledge of one's own past was the most dangerous currency in St. Mary Mead. As Penrose's breathing steadied faintly, Miss Marple noticed an odd thing. The corner of his sleeve, where it rested, against the sofa, bore a fresh tear. A single, loose thread curled from it. Pale blue. The pale blue thread trembling from Mr. Penrose's sleeve seemed to pulse in the lamplight, as though it held the rhythm his faint breath could not. Miss Marple regarded it without touching her eyes, steady, her mind already tracing its symbolic weight. A thread had been left in the drawer. A thread had been caught on her hedge. And now another clung to the sleeve of a man who claimed the drawer had never held anything unusual at all. "Inspector," Dr. Leonard murmured. "He's drifting in and out. You may speak with him, but keep it brief." Crail stepped forward, determined to seize the moment. "Mr. Penrose, can you hear me? Did someone attack you?" The faintest flutter crossed Penrose's eyelids. His mouth worked soundlessly, then formed a small shape, an attempt at a word, a single syllable that dissolved before it reached the air. Miss Marple leaned slightly closer, studying not his lips, but his expression, the flicker of fear, the avoidance, the pain all mixing together. People often revealed the truth not through what they said, but through what they dreaded to say. Mrs. Fenton's voice wavered. "Henry, did you collapse because of what I told you? Because you remember who I am?" Penrose's breathing quickened, not in recognition, but in distress. Miss Marple saw the tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes flickered toward his wife instead. There lay the deeper fear. Dr. Leonard intervened softly. "Enough for now." Mrs. Penrose stood rigid by the mantelpiece, her hands clasping the edge as though she needed its solidity to stay upright. Miss Marple crossed to her with quiet grace. "My dear," she said gently, "your husband's condition is grave, and the truth surrounding this photograph may be heavier than you wish to carry alone." Mrs. Penrose's voice trembled. "I never wanted any of this. I only wanted peace, a life untroubled." "People often wish for peace," Miss Marple replied. "But sometimes peace is built atop things left unresolved. Then the smallest disturbance, like a thread caught in a drawer, can unravel the rest." Mrs. Penrose's eyes filled, but she did not speak. Crail turned sharply toward Miss Marple. "You mentioned earlier that someone may have returned to the drawer. Someone besides Penrose." "Yes, Inspector." She gestured toward the faint mark on the carpet. "Two impressions, distinct, one older, one fresh." Crail followed her gaze, frustration tightening his features. So someone may have retrieved something recently. Or planted something. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And perhaps not everyone who had reason to fear the contents of the drawer bears a man's name." Mrs. Penrose's breath hitched, though she quickly masked it a fraction too late. Before Miss Marple could continue, a sudden thump sounded at the doorway. Tom Derry appeared, flushed and anxious, hat in hand. "Inspectors, sorry to barge in. There's trouble at the post office." He swallowed. "Someone tried to break in." "Back window. Looks like they were after something specific." Crail stiffened. "Not another attack?" "No," Tom said. "But the place was ransacked, and something's missing from behind the counter." "What?" Crail demanded. Tom looked down at his shoes. "The unclaimed letterbox. The one where we keep items waiting for identification. Whoever broke in knew exactly what to look for." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And empty boxes, Tom. Ones that once held letters that never arrived." Tom hesitated. "Two of them. Gone." Mrs. Fenton pressed a hand to her throat. "My letter, the one I came for Miss Marple," nodded softly. "Yes. Someone either sent it or intercepted it. Someone who feared what might surface if its contents were known." The air thickened with unease. Crail rubbed his temples. "So now we have a poisoned man, a missing photograph, a breaking, and two women with ties to his past." His tone hardened. "One of you must tell me who would gain from Mr. Penrose's collapse." Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. "Inspector, sometimes pressing too hard at this stage produces only further concealment. Let the truth come of its own accord. But," she added, stepping closer to Mrs. Penrose, "there is one question that must be answered now." Mrs. Penrose looked as though her knees might give way. Miss Marple's voice remained soft, almost sorrowful. "My dear, earlier today, Before fainting, you said you opened the drawer to see if anything was missing. But why would you think anything was missing unless you already feared someone had been in it? Mrs. Penrose's lips parted, then closed again, trembling. Miss Marple saw the flicker of realization, the understanding that she could no longer maintain appearances without consequence. In that fragile moment, truth pressed against her composure like a breath-fogging glass. The fragile silence trembling around Mrs. Penrose stretched until it seemed the room itself held its breath. Miss Marple watched the woman's resolve waver, her fingers trembling against the mantelpiece as though she feared the very act of speaking would cause something irrevocable to break. Inspector Crail sensed the moment as well. He stepped forward, though Miss Marple's faint, cautionary glance slowed him. She knew that truth, when pressed too suddenly, tended to recoil into deeper shadows. Mrs. Penrose exhaled shakily. I feared the drawer had been disturbed because it was not the first time. Her voice was soft, cracked at the edges. I noticed it 2 nights ago, only a little, just slightly ajar. But Henry insisted it was nothing, that I'd imagined it. I thought perhaps I had. A faint, pained smile touched her lips. One doubts one's own senses easily when it is convenient for others. Miss Marple nodded gently. And that is why you checked it after the mending circle today? Yes. Mrs. Penrose's breath caught. Because I felt someone had been near it again, and they had. The photograph wasn't even hidden deeply, just tucked under the letters. Her voice broke, as though meant to be found. A ripple of unease moved through the room. Crail crossed his arms. So either you placed it there for someone to discover, or someone wanted you to discover it. Mrs. Penrose flinched. I didn't place it there. I swear I didn't. Miss Marple watched her closely. The tremor in her voice spoke not of deceit, but of fear, a fear that had grown roots long before today. Did you recognize the photograph? Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Penrose's eyes glistened. Not at first. It was faded, damaged, but the faces. I recognized it. She pressed a hand to her chest. It was a picture of Henry, much younger, with another woman. Mrs. Fenton gasped, turning away as if struck. Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward her, quietly noting the woman's reaction, not judging its sincerity. Crail's expression hardened. This other woman, could it have been Mrs. Fenton? Mrs. Penrose shook her head. No, it wasn't her. She hesitated. It looked more like his sister. His sister? Crail echoed, frowning. But Mr. Penrose told me he had no living relatives. Mrs. Fenton pivoted sharply. No living relatives under that name, she said bitterly. Hartley, me husband, had a sister, a troubled one. She left home after an argument. None of us heard from her again. The inspector stiffened. Are you suggesting Penrose's past may involve the sister as well? Mrs. Fenton's voice trembled. He was devoted to her. Foolishly so. She took advantage of him, got into trouble, relied on him to fix every mess. Until one day she stopped writing altogether. He searched for her, and then he vanished too. The blue thread in Miss Marple's glove seemed to tug with meaning. An echo of tangled loyalties, frayed bonds, and the thin line between duty and guilt. Crail paced briefly. Why didn't you mention this earlier? Because, Mrs. Fenton whispered, I didn't know until I saw the drawer open earlier today. I thought sadly that the person looking out the window might be her. This disclosure hung in the lamplight with a strange, sorrowful weight. Miss Marple moved toward the drawer unit, her delicate steps drawing all eyes. She rested a hand lightly on its polished surface. There is something we must consider, she said softly. If someone wished the past to resurface, they might plant a photograph. But if someone feared the past, they might retrieve it, perhaps discreetly, perhaps in haste. She turned to Crail. And haste often leaves traces. Crail followed her meaning immediately. The blue thread. Indeed. Miss Marple nodded. It has clung to the hedge, to the drawer, and to the sleeve. I dare say it will cling to other places if we look closely. Mrs. Penrose's gaze dropped to her own dress, not blue, not even close. Mrs. Fenton's attire bore no fibers that matched. The inspector's uniform, Dr. Leonard's coat, none aligned with that particular pale shade. Only one person in the room seemed to realize the implication at the exact moment Miss Marple glanced at him. Tom Derry shifted uneasily, his eyes flickering toward the scrap of thread Miss Marple had earlier shown the inspector. His jacket, simple, serviceable, was trimmed with patches of worn stitching along the sleeves, patches repaired with pale blue thread. Crail stared at him, stunned. "Tom, what exactly were you doing near the Penrose cottage earlier today?" Tom's breath hitched. "Two told you. I only passed by. I saw Mr. Penrose." Miss Marple stepped closer to him, her voice gentle despite the growing tension. "My dear, threads tell their stories even when people struggle to." Tom's eyes widened in panic. Before he could speak, before he could deny or confess, a sudden, sharp knock echoed from the front door. 3 measured raps. The room froze. Miss Marple lifted her head slightly, listening with the acute awareness of someone who recognized not just the knock, but the timing of it. A visitor had come, and they had chosen this moment, precisely this moment, to appear. The 3 measured knocks reverberated through the cottage, crisp and composed, far too deliberate for panic, far too self-assured for chance. Inspector Crail motioned for silence, though no one in the room seemed capable of speech. Even Dr. Leonard paused mid-task, his hand hovering above Mr. Penrose's wrist, as though the sound itself altered the pulse beneath his fingers. Crail stepped toward the door, shoulders squared. Miss Marple remained exactly where she stood, though the light in her eyes shifted an attentive narrowing, as though she were listening for something just beyond the audible world. Threads, she knew, did not merely tangle. They tightened. The door opened with a slow creak. On the threshold stood Miss Hartnell, composed, upright, and far too serene for the hour. Her hat was fixed neatly, her coat buttoned, her lips pressed into that familiar expression of quiet authority she reserved for moments when she believed the village was not meeting her standards. "I saw light still on," she announced, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Naturally, I grew concerned. One can't be too careful when rumors are already running wild. Crail's patience thinned visibly. "Miss Hartnell, this is not—" She held up a hand. "Inspector, please. I am perfectly aware that a gentleman has collapsed. One assumes foul play." A ripple of discomfort traveled through the room. Mrs. Penrose looked away, trembling. Mrs. Fenton stood rigid, her eyes darting toward the hallway as though seeking escape. Tom Derry's pulse visibly jumped at his throat. Miss Marple broke the tension first, her tone polite yet faintly edged with curiosity. "My dear Miss Hartnell, what brings you here at such a particular and delicate moment?" Miss Hartnell's gaze swept the room with the brisk thoroughness of a woman taking inventory at the harvest fair. A sense of civic duty, and, she added coolly, "I came across something on my walk this evening that I felt should be given directly to the inspector." She reached into her handbag. Crail's jaw tightened. And what might that be? Miss Hartnell withdrew a folded slip of paper, creased, faded, and unmistakably old. She held it lightly between 2 fingers, like a prize. "I found this," she declared, "near the hedgerow behind the post office. It struck me as rather incriminating." Mrs. Fenton gasped softly, stepping forward as if drawn by a thread of her own. Mrs. Penrose clutched her shawl to her chest. Tom Derry's breath hitched audibly. Crail accepted the paper, unfolding it with a mixture of caution and dread. It was a photograph. Faded, yellowed, torn along one edge. A younger Henry Penrose. Hartley stood beside a young woman whose features resembled his strongly. The sister, the missing sister, the one who had slipped from family history like a page torn from a book. Crail turned the photo toward Miss Marple. She examined it with delicate precision, noting not the faces, but the substance. The corner edges were smooth from long keeping, yet one fold was newly deepened, recently handled. A faint smudge clung to one edge, something that might have been soil or tears. She looked up not at the inspector, nor at the man on the sofa, but at Miss Hartnell. "Where precisely did you find this?" "Behind the post office," Miss Hartnell repeated firmly. "On the path. Someone must have dropped it while fleeing the scene of that unfortunate breaking." Her eyes flicked toward Tom Derry with calculated implication. Tom's face blanched. "I didn't, Miss Marple. You know I didn't." Crail's gaze hardened. "Miss Hartnell, did you see anyone near the post office at the time?" "I saw movement," she said carefully. "A male figure, hard to distinguish, but running." "And the photograph was simply lying there?" Crail pressed. "Yes." Her tone sharpened. "I picked it up for safekeeping." Miss Marple's expression grew contemplative. "You recognize the face?" Miss Hartnell sniffed. "Not the young woman, but Mr. Penrose, oh yes. One never forgets a face that smiles too broadly." The faintest quiver crossed Mrs. Penrose's mouth. Crail folded the photograph. "This will be taken as evidence?" Miss Hartnell nodded gravely, as though expecting applause. But Miss Marple was studying her closely Noah gloves, the faint dust on her hem, and the slightest snag on her sleeve. A snag of pale blue, the color nearly lost in the lamplight, yet unmistakable to eyes trained on the subtle betrayals of fabric. She exhaled softly. "Inspector," she said, "may I see the photograph for a moment? There is a small crease I wish to examine." Crail handed it to her. Miss Marple turned it over. On the back, barely visible, was a penciled line. Not a name, not a date, but a single letter. H. Henry? Hartley? No, Miss Marple knew handwriting well enough to recognize the curve belonged to neither. She looked up, meeting Miss Hartnell's eyes directly. "You found this lying on the path?" "Yes," Miss Hartnell repeated, lips tightening. "And you did not open it until now?" "No, certainly not." Miss Marple smiled faintly gently, almost regretful. "Then it is curious," she said softly, "that the crease at the corner matches precisely the width of your handbag clasp." The room seemed to tilt. Miss Hartnell went very still. Crail stared. "Are you saying?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She turned her gaze toward Tom Derry, whose frightened eyes flicked between the adults like those of a cornered bird. Then to Mrs. Fenton, who seemed on the verge of collapsing herself. Then to Mrs. Penrose, whose trembling had grown nearly imperceptible, controlled only by the deepest force of will. Miss Marple stepped closer to the photograph, running her fingertip along the fold line slowly, thoughtfully. "There is," she murmured, "something we must consider before we proceed further." Her voice softened to a hushed whisper, threading through the stillness like a drawn breath before a confession. Not every person who hides a secret fears exposure. Some fear losing the power the secret gives them. Mrs. Penrose looked up sharply. Mrs. Fenton stiffened. Tom's breath halted, and Miss Hartnell's pupils narrowed just slightly, but unmistakably. A shift. Small, telling. Miss Marple lowered the photograph. And in the heavy silence that followed, she knew the final threads of truth had begun to tighten at last. The silence after Miss Marple's measured observation held the room taut, as if every person within it had suddenly become aware of the faint hum of truth tightening around them. Inspector Crail, alert now to every shift of posture and breath, stepped closer to Miss Hartnell. Not threatening, but quietly prepared. Miss Hartnell adjusted her coat with forced composure. I don't quite understand the implication, she said stiffly. Anyone might have handled that photograph before I found it. Indeed, Miss Marple replied gently. But the crease is fresh, and the alignment is too precise. One learns to recognize the marks of handbags over many years, especially those with a distinctive clasp, such as yours. All eyes turned to the polished metal clasp that glinted beneath Miss Hartnell's gloved hand. Miss Hartnell laughed a brittle, practiced sound. Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple? Really, this is absurd. Miss Marple's gaze softened. My dear, I am merely suggesting that the photograph was not found, but placed, planted, rather recently. A faint panic flickered in Miss Hartnell's eyes before she smothered it beneath indignation. Ridiculous. Why on earth would I plant a photograph? Miss Marple looked around the room, allowing the question to settle before answering. Perhaps, she said softly, because a planted clue directs suspicion where one wishes it to fall, and suspicion in the wrong hands can be used as a tool of influence. Or revenge. Mrs. Penrose drew a sharp breath. Mrs. Fenton's fingers tightened around her handbag. Tom Derry looked from one face to another, confusion bleeding into dread. Crail's voice sliced through the hush. Miss Hartnell, where were you earlier this evening specifically, just before Mr. Penrose collapsed? Miss Hartnell folded her arms. At home. I stepped out only briefly for air. Crail narrowed his eyes. Any witnesses? No, she snapped. Miss Marple stepped closer, her movements quiet, deliberate. And did you know, Miss Hartnell, that the blue thread in the very shade used in your mending basket at the circle earlier today matches the fibers found in the Penroses' garden? A flicker of horror-fury passed through Miss Hartnell's expression. That proves nothing. I carry needlework everywhere. A dozen threads could slip from my sleeve at any time. Miss Marple nodded with gentle agreement. Quite true. Which is why I began looking not for what the thread suggested, but what the thread concealed. She turned to Tom, whose panic had risen steadily. My dear boy, she said kindly, you believed I suspected you. I'm sorry for that. But the thread on your coat was from the repair you made yourself, not the thread lodged in the drawer. Yours is coarse. The drawer thread is finer. More expensive. The kind used in decorative hems, not postal uniforms. Tom sagged in relief. Miss Marple continued. And when I recalled the women present at the mending circle today, I remembered only one person working with fine blue thread. Her gaze rested gently upon Miss Hartnell. Yours? Miss Hartnell opened her mouth and then closed it, breath trembling. Crail stepped forward. Miss Hartnell, I must ask directly, did you enter the Penroses' home today? I did not, she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. I was merely concerned. People talk. Miss Marple talks. This is not about gossip, Miss Marple said softly. It is about patterns. The drawer was disturbed before the mending circle. The curtain at the post office fluttered when no breeze stirred. And Mrs. Penrose fainted not from fear of the photograph, but from fear of who stood behind her as she held it. All eyes turned to Mrs. Penrose. Her hands trembled, and her lips parted involuntarily, as if compelled toward truth. Miss Marple pressed gently. You recognized the figure in the doorway? You recognized them long before today, didn't you? Mrs. Penrose's eyes filled with tears. I didn't want to believe it. Crail turned sharply. Who did she see? Mrs. Penrose lifted her shaking hand and pointed slowly, painfully toward Miss Hartnell. The room froze. Miss Hartnell staggered back a step, fury flushing her cheeks. Lies! I never, but Mrs. Penrose was already speaking in a rush, words tumbling out from the pressure of weeks, perhaps years of fear. You threatened me, she whispered. You came to my garden at dusk last week and warned me that some secrets were better left buried. You said Henry wasn't who he pretended to be. You said you'd make sure the village knew. Miss Hartnell's lips trembled with indignation, but her eyes betrayed something colder beneath. Crail closed the distance between them. Miss Hartnell, do you deny being near the Penroses' cottage? Do you deny forcing your way inside? Do you deny tampering with a drawer? Miss Hartnell's face contorted, not guilt, but rage. Yes, I deny all of it. Miss Marple's voice cut through, soft as silk, yet sharp as a needle. But who, she asked quietly, would stand silently behind a woman opening a drawer, then vanish before she could turn? Who would fear the truth so deeply that they would poison a man rather than let the past speak? Miss Hartnell's breath hitched a tiny sound, easily missed but unmistakable to Miss Marple. And then something subtle shifted in her posture. A stiffening, a calculation. Miss Marple watched it all with gentle sorrow. Crail's hand moved to his pocket. Miss Hartnell, I must ask you to come with, but Miss Marple lifted a hand. Not yet, Inspector. The room stilled once more, poised on a fragile balance. Miss Marple stepped forward, so close she could see the faintest tremor in Miss Hartnell's jaw. There is one more truth, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it belongs to someone else in this room. Her gaze turned slowly, not to Miss Hartnell, nor to Tom, nor to Mrs. Fenton, but to Mrs. Penrose. And at that moment, Mrs. Penrose's face went utterly white. Mrs. Penrose swayed as though Miss Marple's gaze had struck something deep and long buried within her. The room held her in a hush so complete that even the doctor's quiet movements beside the sofa seemed distant, softened by the weight of what hovered unsaid. Miss Hartnell, frozen in her posture of injured pride, blinked in disbelief as attention shifted away from her. Tom Derry's breath hitched. Mrs. Fenton clutched the back of a chair as though bracing herself for a familiar grief. Inspector Crail frowned. Mrs. Penrose, Miss Marple is indicating Miss Marple raised a hand gently, her voice warm but unwavering. No accusations, Inspector. Not yet. Mrs. Penrose must speak in her own time. Mrs. Penrose's lips parted, then closed, trembling. Her fingers dug into her shawl, twisting the fabric as though trying to anchor herself to something solid. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she whispered, the words escaping before she could contain them. Crail's stance shifted. Go this far? Mrs. Penrose, are you saying let her speak? Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Penrose pressed a hand to her forehead. When the drawer was disturbed the first time, I knew someone had found what I'd hidden, but it wasn't the photograph they found. Her eyes shone with tears. It was a letter. Mrs. Fenton inhaled sharply, as though she already knew which one. A letter, Miss Marple repeated softly. From Mr. Penrose's, Hartley's sister. Mrs. Penrose nodded weakly. He told me she was dead, that his past was buried. I believed him. I lived by that belief. But then the letter arrived, addressed to no one in particular, a plea, a warning. She was alive barely, and he'd abandoned her after some dreadful scandal. She swallowed. I confronted him. He swore it was all lies. But I saw the fear in his eyes. And suddenly the whole tangle of threads, blue and otherwise, lay bare before Miss Marple's mind. You hid the letter in the drawer, she said gently, hoping he would never find it. Mrs. Penrose nodded. I thought if I kept it hidden, it would lose its power, but someone else came looking. Someone who believed Henry's past could ruin him. Or ruin me. Her gaze shifted to Miss Hartnell, not accusingly, but with the weary recognition of someone who had been watched for far longer than she realized. Miss Marple filled the silence softly. Miss Hartnell prides herself on guarding the village's moral respectability. Anything that threatens that facade troubles her deeply. A stiff line formed along Miss Hartnell's jaw. I merely sought to protect you, sought to control, Miss Marple said kindly. A very different thing, my dear." Before Miss Hartnell could retort, Mrs. Penrose continued, voice shaking. "When I found the drawer open today, I knew the photograph had been planted. I knew someone wanted Henry exposed. Tears spilled over. But I never poisoned him. I never touched anything of his. I only wish the truth weren't true." Crail's brow furrowed. "If not you, and not Miss Hartnell, then who administered the toxin?" "It may not have been administered deliberately at all," Miss Marple replied softly. "Some poisons do not require a hand, only neglect or guilt." She turned to Dr. Leonard. "Did you find anything unusual on Mr. Penrose?" The doctor hesitated. There was residue on his left sleeve, like he'd spilled something on himself earlier. "I plan to test it." Miss Marple nodded. The tear on his sleeve where the blue thread caught was fresh. He may have brushed against something he thought was harmless. Crail blinked. "Are you suggesting accidental poisoning?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "No, Inspector. Merely that guilt often brings a man into contact with dangerous things, letters, memories, old debts." Mr. Penrose fled the garden quickly, perhaps after finding something he feared. She sighed gently, or after meeting someone he didn't expect. All eyes turned instinctively to Mrs. Fenton. She stepped forward, anguish written across her features. "I didn't hurt him. I only followed him when he left the house. I wanted to ask why he left me, but when he saw me, he stumbled back like he'd seen a ghost. He ran toward the garden. I never touched him." Miss Marple nodded. "Your presence was enough to unseat the careful life he'd constructed." Crail looked between the two women. "But the break-in at the post office?" "That," Miss Marple said gently, "was an act of fear and desperation, not malice. Someone wanted a letter gone. Someone terrified the past was about to speak." She turned to Miss Hartnell. "Your civic concern led you there first, did it not?" Miss Hartnell's silence confessed more than words. "And Tom," Miss Marple continued, "simply stumbled into misinterpretation because he happened to be nearby. Blue thread travels easily, wind, hedges, sleeves. But patterns do not lie." Tom exhaled in relief, nearly collapsing into a chair. Miss Marple turned back to Mrs. Penrose, speaking with a tenderness that softened the room. "My dear, your greatest mistake was believing that truth, once hidden, could stay harmless. But nothing in a drawer, whether thread, letter, or photograph, ever stays where it is put." Mrs. Penrose wept quietly. Mrs. Fenton leaned against the wall, tears slipping down her face. Miss Hartnell's rigid posture finally faltered. Crail rubbed his temples. So the poisoning, whether accidental contact or not, was triggered by his attempts to hide evidence? Miss Marple nodded. "The residue will tell us precisely what, but the moral truth is clear. Henry Penrose collapsed under the weight of his own past. Others tugged the threads, but he tied the knot." Dr. Leonard approached, voice gentle. "He will recover. With care." A faint murmur escaped Mr. Penrose, an apology, perhaps, or a name neither wife nor former wife wished to hear. Miss Marple stepped back, letting the village exhale. The storm had passed, though not without leaving its mark. The Penrose's lamp flickered, steadied, and cast its warm glow once more across the room, illuminating the small drawer where it had all begun. A simple piece of furniture, yet capable of holding years of buried truths. Miss Marple watched it with quiet melancholy. "Secrets," she murmured, "have a way of whispering themselves free." And outside, in the soft night breeze, a pale blue thread drifted from the hedge, its purpose fulfilled at last.